discussed earlier, we are going to take up the 19th century novel, that is during Victorian fiction. It's also called as the literature or the works or the fiction, the literary works during Victorian period, in which we're going to talk about the 19th century novel. And basically, we're going to look into two important novels by Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. So, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Charles Dickens' Hard Times. Right. So, here, before I start the session, I would like to just give you a kind of a talk about the 19th century, because you all remember yesterday it was all about the 18th century. Then what exactly, I mean, what kind of a thing it was? I mean, what was it like, the features of the novel or whatever it was during the 19th century is what we're going to look into today. So during the 19th century, the novel became the leading form of literature in English. Now, the works by pre Victorian writers such as Jane Austen and Walter Scott had perfected both closely observed social satire and historical fiction. Now, serialized popular novels won unprecedented readership and led to increasing artistic sophistication. Now, the 19th century is often regarded as a high point in European literature and Victorian literature, including the works of Emily and Charlotte Bronte, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Lewis Carroll, Wilkie Collins, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, A.E. Housman, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker, Alfred Lord Tennyson, William Makepeace, Thackeray, Anthony Trollope, and Oscar Wilde remain widely popular. Now, influenced as they were by the large, sprawling novels of sensibility of the preceding age, they tended to be idealized portraits of difficult lives in which hard work, perseverance, love, and luck win out in the end. Virtue would be rewarded and wrongdoers are suitably punished. Now, they tended to be an improving nature with a central moral lesson at heart, informing the reader how to be a good Victorian. Now, this formula was the basis for which much of earlier Victorian fiction, but as the century progressed, the tone grew darker. Now, let me just share the screen. Yeah. So here we see the slides, which I'm sharing it here. Well, which talks about the 19th century novel. And let me just give you a kind of um, the features of this before we move on to the fiction of this period. So Queen Victoria, the ruler, the Victorian period, we call it by her name. And during, I mean, it was from 1819 to 1901. At the age of 18, Victoria inherited the throne. She reigned for 64 years, and the sun never sets on the Queen's empire. The power and influence of Britain around the world, and she died a lonely ruler. Now, look at this condition, the social conditions during her period. One is the Industrial Revolution. Villagers moved to the cities. And there were a lot of factories set up because of which they've procured jobs, and it was quite because of this urbanization due to industrial revolution, there was a lot of pollution. And uh, and uh, also at the same time we also could see luxury side by side with poverty. It was like, it was the best of time and it was the worst of times, by Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. And this is when there we can see a prominent rise, the Victorian novel, the novel that had a big success in the Victorian age because it reflected the great social changes of this period. It was very popular among the educated middle classes. It reflected their values. Many readers were women. They often borrowed books from circulating libraries. Novels were often published in installments, importance of linearity. Now, if you look into the pioneers of the novel, it was Daniel Defoe, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Lawrence Sterne, and the kind of novels, the types of novels we get to see are graphic novel, picaresque novel, Booker Prize epistolary novel, psychological novel. Now, when we look into, before going into the types of novels, let me just talk a bit more about the Victorian period. And so, in the mid 19th century, Victorian literature emerged during the reign of Queen Victoria in Britain, spanning from 1837 to 1901. A unique set of characteristics marked this literary era, reflecting the social, political, and cultural changes of the time. Now, characteristics of Victorian novel. What were the features? Like, you have realism, morality and didacticism, social critic, idealism versus realism, industrialization and its discontents, psychological character development, the woman question, narrative experimentation, the supernatural and Gothic, attention to detail. Now, we all know what realism is, and where Victorian literature often shows real people and real life situations. Now, writers like Charles Dickens did not shy away from the grim parts of city life and the struggles of people experiencing poverty. Coming to the morality and didactism, Victorian novels are often aimed at teaching readers right from wrong. The stories were like lessons on how to live a good life. The writers of that time believed books could make people better. So, hence, what did they do? They filled their stories with clear morals to guide readers towards good behavior. And I can quote an example for which, the Charles Dickens novel, A Christmas Carol, which shows the character Ebenezer Scrooge undergoing a transformation from a miserly, selfish man to a generous and compassionate one. Coming to social critic, Victorian literature often used stories to point out what was wrong with society. Authors like Thomas Hardy and Elizabeth Gaskell wrote about how unfair life was for people experiencing poverty, how children had to work, and how the class system stopped people from moving up in the world. Now, these books actually opened people's eyes to the problems around them and made them think about change. So, the writers were not afraid to show the ugly side of their world, and they hoped their books would make people want to fix these issues. Now, in fact, this is how the literature was not just mere reading pleasure, but it also was a mirror showing society its flaws, hoping to push for a better future for everyone. Now, for example, you can mention Charles Dickens, where his novels, including Oliver Twist and Hard Times, they highlight social injustices and the plight of people experiencing poverty in the industrial age. Charlotte Bronte, her novel Jane Eyre, addresses the constraints on women and class inequalities, offering insights into the status of governance and the limited autonomy of women. Then we have George Eliot. Through works like Middlemarch, she explores issues such as the role of women in society and the need for social reform. Then we have Elizabeth Gaskell. Her novels like North and South examine the class divide and the impact of industrialization on workers and their communities. Now, Thomas Hardy, in novels such as Tess of the Villiers, Hardy critiques societal norms and injustices faced by individuals, particularly women in rural England. Now, idealism versus realism. Victorian novels often mixed real life with a touch of hope. Writers showed the world as it was with all its problems, but they also like to add some idealism. They wrote about the truth, the harsh lives of people, the unfairness they faced, but they also believed things could improve. Now, many stories ended with the good guys winning or feeling that justice would be served. Then we have industrialization and its discontents. Now, Victorian literature often reflected on the significant changes brought by industrialization. Now, factories sprang up, cities swelled, and life sped up. This new world made some people rich, but others suffered in poor working conditions and crowded slums. Now, writers like Dickens in Hard Times showed how this progress could harm people and the environment. Now, others like Elizabeth Gaskell in North and South looked at the tension between old ways and new industry. Now, coming to the psychological character development. Now, Victorian novels often took readers deep into the minds of their characters. Now, these characters grow and change throughout the story, making them feel like real people. The woman question. In Victorian times, writers started to question the role of women in society. They asked if women should have the same rights as men, like voting, owning property, or getting an education. Now, novels from this time often show women trying to find their place in a world that limits them. For example, in Pride and Prejudice, that is how, this is one, this is the novel which is prescribed for us in this blog, where by Austen, the heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, fights for her right to marry for love, not just money. Now, George Eliot's characters like Dorothea in Middlemarch look for more than just a good marriage. Now, this is what they want to make a difference in the world. Now, these books open people's eyes to the idea that women have their minds and should be able to use them just like men. The narrative experiment. This is again another very important feature of this Victorian period, that is narrative experimentation. Now, Victorian writers were very creative with how they told the stories. They did not just go from start to finish. They mixed things up. Some used letters or diary entries to build the tale, like Bram Stoker in Dracula. Now, others like Wilkie Collins in Moonstone had different people take turns to tell their versions of the story. Now, this way, readers get many angles on the same event. Now, the supernatural and Gothic. Now, Victorian novels often mixed in spooky, mysterious elements. This style is called Gothic. It includes old dark houses, ghosts, and strange happenings. So, books like Dracula by Bram Stoker had vampires and castles, which were creepy and exciting. Now, these stories use the supernatural to explore human fears and the unknown. Now, Gothic tales were not just about frightening readers, they also made them think about life, death, and what it means to be human. They were popular because they were thrilling, but they made people consider big questions through their chilling adventures. Now, attention to detail. Now, Victorian literature is known for its meticulous attention to detail. Writers of this era painted vivid pictures of people, places, and things in their stories. They described everything in great detail, from the characters' appearances and emotions to the settings and even the most miniature objects. Now, this level of detail made the stories come alive for readers, allowing them to immerse themselves in the fictional world. Now, authors like Charles Dickens and George Eliot were masters at creating rich and immersive narratives through their careful attention to even the minutest aspects of their storytelling, making the Victorian literary experience incredibly vivid and captivating. So, when you talk about the types of novels which we can, I mean, which are quite evident and we visibility, I mean, the kind which they had come up during this period were picaresque novel, where, the picaresque novel relates the adventures of an eccentric or disreputable hero in episodic form. The genre gets its name from the Spanish word picaro or rogue. Now, examples for this, like Rudyard Kipling's Kim and Henry Fielding's The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling, are some of the examples of this type of a novel called the picaresque novel. Next one, the Gothic novel, as I already told you, I think in the previous session also we did come across this Gothic novel, which is all about the terror, mystery, horror, thriller, supernatural, doom, death, decay, old haunted buildings with ghosts and so on. Coming to the historical novel, in this which is a you know novel that has its setting a period of history and which attempts to convey the spirit, manners, and social conditions of a past age with realistic detail and fidelity to historical fact. The work may deal with actual historical personages, as does Robert Graves' Claudius, or it may contain a mixture of fictional and historical characters. A historical novel is a novel set in a period earlier than that of the writing. Characteristics of Victorian literature. There are a few primary features of Victorian literature. Now, as I already explained, that this is the age which tends to depict daily life, and it did reflect the practical problems and interests of daily life. Victorian literature often presented varied social classes of people rather than just the aristocracy. Now, this is something which made it more popular among the middle classes. Now, Victorian literature often had a moral purpose and tended to deviate from the earlier concept of art for art's sake. Victorians wanted their art to do more than just appease the senses. They wanted it to serve a purpose, often a moral or a political one. The Victorian era tended to be an era of doubt and pessimism. The influence of science is felt here as scientific advances led people to feel uncertain about the future. The second half of the Victorian era is influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, books of the Victorian era were characterized by things both practical and materialistic. Now, most of the writers exalted a purely ideal life. Right, coming to the sentimental novel. This is again another type of novel of sensibility, is an 18th century literary genre which celebrates the emotional and intellectual concepts of sentiment. sentimentalism, and sensibility. The best example here would be Samuel Richardson, Pamela, and Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, Sentimental Journey, and so on. Coming to anti-novel. An anti-novel is an experimental work of fiction that avoids the familiar conventions of the novel and instead establishes its own conventions. Examples: Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. Then there is again another kind of novel which you call it as memoir novel. A memoir is a narrative written from the perspective of the author about an important part of their life. It's often conflated with autobiography, but there are a few important differences. An autobiography is also written from the author's perspective, but the narrative spans their entire life. Next, moving on to the graphic novels. Now, graphic novels are simply defined book length comics. Sometimes they tell a single continuous narrative form from first page to last. Sometimes they are collection of shorter stories or individual comic strips. And the best example would be Frank Miller's Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, The Fantastic Four, and X-Men. Okay, now moving on to the world of, this is what it means, what fiction is all about. And when you talk about novel, it is nothing but fiction, right? So, what is the meaning of a fiction? The world of fiction is the world of the imagined, although authors sometimes draw on their experiences and even certain periods in history when they write. Fiction tells us an invented story using prose. So, when you talk about the types of narrative fiction, they are novel, novella, and short story. So, what is novel? A novel is an invented prose narrative of significant length and complexity that deals imaginatively with human experience. Its roots can be traced back thousands of years, though its origins in English are traditionally placed in the 18th century. Novella. A novel is a narrative prose fiction whose length is shorter than most novels, but longer than most short stories. So, this is something which falls between novel and a short story. The English word novella derives from the Italian novella, meaning a short story related to true facts or apparently so, right? Short story is what is shorter than a novella. The word count for a novella is from 17,000 words to 40,000 words, while the other ranges from 1,000 to 7,500 words. A short story is expected to be read in one sitting, while a novella is somewhat shorter than a novel. Well, what are the hallmarks of fiction? They are realistic characters, human experiences, and identifiable settings. Right. Now, these are some of the elements of fiction. Now, from here on, we're going to look into the key elements which makes up fiction. The first thing is characters. So, in any story, the characters support the plot. The main character is often called the protagonist. Now, the dialogues, including diction, actions, gestures, and appearances, are all keys to understanding the character. That is how you're going to know what kind of a role the character is playing. Now, the term characterization refers to the way the author reveals and develops characters. Coming to the setting. Setting is again another key term for this fiction. An element of fiction. The geographical, historical, and social location of the story refers to its setting. Now, looking at the setting, you can, tell a lot about the tone and overall purpose. Tone again. What is tone? It is again one of the chief element of a fiction. The mood of a story is often referred to as the tone, and tone is conveyed by sentence structure and diction. Now, coming to another important point, that is point of view. The phrase point of view refers to the person or persons telling the story or relating the ideas. And it refers to the perspective from which a story is told to the reader, whether it is the first person or the third person. And first and third person are the most common narrative types. Second person is not usually used in fiction writing. Now, coming to the first person point of view, the writer or the narrator tells the story from his or her very own point of view, and it is the I point of view. So basically, you come across a lot of I told this, or I narrated, or I have seen, and a lot of I point of view. Now, the third person point of view, the writer tells the story from a character's standpoint. The objective point of view, here the writer tells the story as a detached observer. Omniscient point of view. Now, this is also called the second person point of view. The writer who uses this point of view knows everything about the characters and tells it to the readers from outside the story. Now, when you talk about the author's point of view, that is uh, the dialogue and narration. What is a dialogue? When characters speak. What is the difference between dialogue and narration is when the narrator speaks, right? So dialogue is when characters speak, narration is when the narrator speaks. Now, quotation marks separate narration from the dialogue. Now, for the example, you can see there is one example. Help, my cousin Jack said. So this is something which separates narration from the dialogue. How do we identify narrative perspective? So it's about the narrator who tells the story. Here we're not looking at the dialogue. We don't care what characters say. Only the narrator's voice matters. Now, how do we identify? When you happen to, I mean, there are a kind of a keywords or the signal words which gives you the perspective to understand the narrator's viewpoint. That is the first person, I, me, my, mine, we, us, ours, and the second person, you, your, third person, he, she, her, they, them. So, for example, this is the first person. I am in the room. That is the first person. You come in the room. You come inside the room. That's the second person. Then he or she came into the room. That is, he or she is the third person. Now, coming to the third person, omniscient. Now, here, omniscient, it indicates narrator tells thoughts and feelings of, because narrator is all knowing here. Omniscient indicates that all knowing. Narrator tells thoughts and feelings of more than one character. For example, Tim was mad at Shay. He blamed her. Shay knew Tim would be mad, but she wanted to live her life. So here it's like knowing the thoughts. I mean, the narrator speaks about the thoughts and feelings of more than one character. The third person limited. So it's just the opposite of the omniscient. Omniscient, where he knows everything. I mean, about the feelings or the emotions of the characters, where in third person limited, it is limited to only one character. Now he tells the thoughts and feelings of only one character. Now, for example, Tim was mad at Shay. He blamed her. Shay just left without saying anything. She left a note and then left him. So it talks only about Tim, not about the Shay like the earlier example. Now, the third person objective narrator does not reveal any character's thoughts or feelings. Now, only characters' dialogues and actions are narrated. For example, Tim slammed the door. He walked upstairs and read a note from Shay. He kicked her trash and and can and started crying. I mean, they're just objective person, a third person objective is nothing but their dialogue and actions are narrated. Just the actions. That's it. The next, coming to the element of the fiction is the plot. The events of the story that make a cohesive or whole. Now, a flashback is a return to an earlier time. Foreshadowing provides a hint of something to come. So it's like these are some of these you come across. What is a flashback and what is a foreshadowing? Plot is nothing but the entire ground of the story, where all the um, events occur, which tells and talks about it. Now, coming to the theme, the central or main idea of a work is its theme. The following elements can provide clues about the theme, such as title. I mean, looking at these, you will be able to. I mean, they act like a clue, and that will also tell you something, some kind of a theme to it. So, setting, point of view, characters, plot and conflict, use of symbolism. Characters. Now, characters can be people, can be animals, or even objects like pencils or robots. Now, the plot is the series of events in a story and can be broken down into five parts. They are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Now, plot is always centered around at least one conflict. So, for any fiction to develop, please remember that there should be a conflict to be uh, made it into a fictitious story. Right. Exposition is what? It's kind of a background information about the characters. That is just an intro, a kind of a beginning. The rising action, when events that lead up to the climax, and slowly it starts unfolding, the main event which moves ahead towards the climax. Now, what is climax? The highest point of action in the story. Now, usually has the conflict at its peak. Coming to the falling action. Events that lead from the conflict to its resolution. Resolution, the solving of a conflict. Coming to the next novel which is prescribed, that is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And a quick look into her biography, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Jane Austen, born on December 16, 1775, and she was born in England, lived for about 41 years, and had a sister named Cassandra and six brothers. Father was a clergyman, and mother was from a wealthy upper class family. All of her family were avid readers of literature, and they discussed what they read often. Now, this was written and published between 1796 and August 1797. And in fact, it was Austen's first novel and most famous work. It was not published, however, until 1813, 2 years after Sense and Sensibility. Now, her other novels are Northanger Abbey, Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. The major novels, including Pride and Prejudice, were all composed within a short 20-year period. Those 20 years mark a period in history when England was at the height of its power and were still enjoying great military victories over Napoleon and the French. And England was extremely stratified, and class divisions were rooted in family connections and wealth. Social mobility was limited, and class consciousness was strong. Coming to the gender, ideas of socially appropriate behavior for men and women were very clear. Social advancement for young men was found in the military, church, or law. Women could only accomplish this through marriage. And here in this, during this period, women were generally uneducated, leaving them little choice but to find a husband for their own social and economic survival. Now, for women in 19th century, marriage was a central concern in the early 19th century because it involved the social continuance of the family line through inherited property and was the only chance for middle and upper class women to have a tolerable existence. Law, education, and custom closed off many possible avenues of advancement for women. Men ruled the public world of politics and business, women ruled the home. Now, rigid guidelines dictated the lives of respectable married women. They never went out alone. They spent their days supervising servants. They did needlepoint. They made or received visits. They thought of little besides fashion and society. Women's accomplishments. In Austen's day, the daughters of middle and upper class could be sent to school, but their education consisted more of becoming accomplished than it did of expanding their academic knowledge. It was meant to attract men, a man. These skills tended to be neglected after marriage. Reading, playing a musical instrument, singing, drawing, speak modern languages. These were some of the skills which were neglected after marriage. Right. Let us quickly move on to the Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Now, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is a classic comedy of manners that satirizes 18th century society and particularly the expectations placed on women of the era. The novel, which follows the romantic entanglements of the Bennet sisters, includes themes of love, class, as one might guess, pride, and prejudice. Now, these are all covered with Austen's signature wit, including the literary device of free, indirect discourse that permits a particular style of in depth, sometimes satirical narration. Now, let us quickly look into the plot of the Pride and Prejudice. Now, what is the plot of the story, Pride and Prejudice? So, the plot involves Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's growing feelings for each other, along with the recognition that each has misinterpreted the other, all while exterior forces try to persuade them away from each other. Now, Elizabeth's four other sisters, her male cousin, and her mother create drama as they pursue marriages and conduct themselves in ways that are shocking for the times and that nearly ruin Elizabeth and her sister Jane's chances of marrying Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. Now, what is the main message of Pride and Prejudice? There may be three themes in it, but the overall message of Pride and Prejudice is that first impressions can be wrong. And this message is so profound that Austen originally called Pride and Prejudice by the name First Impressions. In the story, Elizabeth's first encounter with Mr. Darcy convinces her that he's too proud and she harbors prejudice against him for this reason. Mr. Darcy also is quick to judge Elizabeth and finds himself reckoning with his wrong assessment of her throughout the novel until he finally admits to himself that he has fallen in love with her. Now, basically, if you look at the themes of this Pride and Prejudice, there are three themes of, and they are family, marriage, and class. So these three themes are intertwined throughout the story of Pride and Prejudice. Now, Jane Austen examines the imbalance between men and women. This includes social, economic, and educational asymmetries. The way that both the original book and its adaptation portrayed the female characters were examined through the prism of feminism. It is clear from the analysis of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that her characters fit in well with modern thought and, more importantly, gain from the transformation. Now, Jane Austen attempted to illustrate human nature in this instance by having the characters gaze at a beautiful object that brings them joy. She outlines the civilization that is constantly focused on money and the pursuit of materialistic existence. This book also discusses the social structure or delivery system that uses the English primogeniture system. A holdover from the feudal system in Normandy is primogeniture. The first male child is the only one to get an inheritance, with the other boys and girls going in search of fortune and the kingdom itself being left empty handed by its parent. So, this is basically her novel Pride and Prejudice. It centers on the burgeoning relationship between Elizabeth Bennet, the daughter of a country gentleman, and the novel's heroine, and Fitzwilliam Darcy, an aristocratic landowner. It is set in rural England at the turn of the 19th century, and it follows the Bennet family, which includes five very different sisters, all of whom their mother is keen to see suitably married. The intersections of these sisters with several eligible bachelors drive the action of the novel. Despite initial friction between them, Elizabeth eventually accepts Darcy's proposal for of marriage. And the title makes it pretty clear that pride is going to be an important theme, but the message is more nuanced than just the concept itself. Right. So moving on to the next novel, which is prescribed in the block, second block, and for us it is Unit 6 that talks about Charles Dickens' Hard Times. So these are some of the literary techniques we find them in Pride and Prejudice. Satire, writing that ridicules or holds up to content, that the faults of individuals or groups. Irony is the technique that involves surprising, interesting, or amusing contradictions. Humor, writing that amuses and entertains. Right. So Charles Dickens from 1812 to 1870, mother Elizabeth Barrow, father John Dickens. He was financially comfortable and then destitute. Parents were sent to a debtor's prison. Now, when Charles was 12 years old, Now, the family was imprisoned for debt. Young Charles forced to work in shoe factory, mostly self-educated, and in 1827 he took a job as a legal clerk. He then worked as a reporter in courts and in parliament. He married Catherine Hogarth, had children, 10 children, 9 to 10 children, spent much of his time in London. He was not a good family man, settled down to comfortable married middle class life. He wrote short humorous sketches with pictures by Boz, which became known as Pickwick Papers, became famous in a short period of time and wildly popular among devoted readers awaiting his next installment. And he gave numerous public readings for money worldwide. Now, these were some of the novels written by Charles Dickens. Nicholas Nickleby, Oliver Twist, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, Martin Chuzzlewit, then Dombey and Son, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Hard Times, Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. Now, what these were the major themes in Dickens' fiction. One, the loneliness of childhood, because he himself has experienced it as his parents were imprisoned. Then, next, oppression of poverty, uncertainty of love and marriage, indifference of social institutions, sustaining joy of family life. The themes were aristocracy, wealth, rich land and power, child labor, family life, lost love and unattainable women, perseverance and sacrifice in face of untold hardships and injustice. He remains the foremost 19th century British writer of fiction. Amazing and detailed depiction of lifestyle and issues of a transforming industrial and urban landscape. So here we have Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Hard Times, it's an excellent illustration of change of the structure of class in England. And as a Victorian a person who belongs to the Victorian period, he was a writer who best reflected the Victorian England and the effects of the Industrial Revolution on people and society. He, in fact, visited a factory in Manchester where he witnessed the situation of the workers in the cotton factory. After this, he wrote Hard Times. He has worked in the fields of economic science and utilitarianism, which form the basis of the Industrial Revolution theory from the plot to the depictions and character names. So, what are the main themes of the Hard Times? The importance of imagination is one central theme of this novel. The other major theme is industrialization and its associated dangers. So he was quite, I mean, um, skeptical about the industrialization. Though it had its own advances and advantages, it also had its own dangers, associated dangers. What's the novel Hard Times about? So it takes place in a fictional factory town named Coketown and follows the lives of a group of people who are intertwined somehow. The novel reflects how the characters' choices lead them to an ending ultimately of their choosing. The moral of Hard Times revolves around the dangers of industrialization, such as exploitation of workers, capitalist greed, etc. Now, another moral is that children should be allowed to use their imaginations and play because just learning facts alone may lead to unhappiness and dullness in life. Now, basically, what was the reason? I mean, why did he had to write this Hard Times? He wrote Hard Times to offer a social commentary on his times. He reflected on various social and moral topics, including industrialization, education, children's rights, corporate greed, etc. Now, this work, Hard Times, was published in the weekly periodical known as Household Words, and then it got published in book format the very same year. And the importance of one's imagination and the dangers of industrialization are two main themes and takeaways of the novel. So, a quick uh, look into the summary of this. So here it goes, the story in this manner. Like Thomas Gradgrind, a wealthy merchant in Coketown, England, focuses on rationalism, self-interest, and fact in his life. He raises his children, Louisa and Tom, following this philosophy, and they are raised by him. Louisa marries Josiah Bounderby, a wealthy factory owner and banker, and Tom is apprenticed at Bounderby's bank. Meanwhile, an impoverished hand named Stephen Blackpool struggles with his love for Rachel, another factory worker. Now, Stephen is unable to marry her because he is already married to a drunken woman who disappears. James Harthouse, a wealthy young sophisticate, arrives in Coketown to start a political career and takes an interest in Louisa. He attempts to corrupt Louisa by forming a union, but is cast out and fired by Bounderby. Louisa visits Harthouse and convinces him to leave Coketown forever. The bank is robbed, and the lone suspect is Stephen, who is seen loitering outside the bank for several nights before disappearing. So Mrs. Sparsit witnesses Harthouse declaring his love for Louisa, but Louisa flees to her father's house. Gradgrin and Louisa realize that Tom is responsible for the robbery and attempt to sneak him out of England with the help of circus performers. However, they are stopped by Bitzer, a young man who embodies Gradgrin's detached rationalism but now sees its limits. Bounderby fires Mrs. Sparsit and sends her away to her hostile relatives. Gradgrin gives up his philosophy of fact and devotes his political power to helping the poor. So this is how the result of the industrial revolution, there was a rise in the middle class and establishments of the working class, and the Victorian bourgeoisie overthrew the Hanoverian aristocracy, and the roles in society changed into that which David Kennedy argues in his book. Now, this is the novel which takes place in a fictional British town of Coketown, and it gives reference to the Industrial Revolution. Right. So, and with this, we come to an end of the session. And I hope you all followed the lesson and kindly read all those the summaries which are given there, the entire text of the novel Hard Times by Charles Dickens, also Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice from the textbook, from the material which is given to you. With this, we come to an end. So the next class, that is again tomorrow around 6 o'clock, it starts, and I want you to kindly go through the material, that is block 3, and you may get back to me if you have any doubts. Thank you.